Well, good evening, gentlemen. This is the Beowulf and the Dragon lecture that I have been promising over the last couple days. It's currently Sunday night, roughly 5:59 p.m. It's going to be 6 o'clock here. So this is a good opportunity just to make sure that we can make it through the other information that we need. I just turned a light on. So, if we take a look at the Beowulf and the Dragon portion of the text, Beowulf is generally considered to be the oldest surviving work of English literature, which is a great reason why we start with it in this course. We talked in a previous session about how the only surviving manuscript is a copy of the poem written between 700 and 1000 BCE. Now, I'm saying that because the new terminology is before the Common Era. So, what used to be BC is now before the Common Era, and CE is Common Era. So, just so we have that in our context. It is possible, however, that the story was passed down as an oral tradition for much longer than just that period of time. So, to fully understand the dragon and the role it plays outside of the pagan concepts, and then, of course, outside of the Christian concepts from the book of Revelation, it's probably important to spend some time looking at the culture and the ideas that it describes. So, Beowulf is set in what is now Scandinavia. The first two parts of the poem take place in Denmark, where Beowulf has traveled in order to kill the two monsters. Now, we've covered that. We talked about symbolism. We talked about the transition from paganism to Christianity. So, in the early parts of the poem, and some of you asked about this, he's about 20 years old. 50 years pass of peace and prosperity when he returns to have to fight the dragon. So he's 70 years old. So I think that's significant. He is clearly a cultural hero. And when we look at why he fights that dragon, I'm just looking at my notes real quick. It seems like at first it's a bad idea. It doesn't make sense, but it's necessary in the context of what an epic poem is. Dragons in literature and in the poem are significant because they represent a serious threat. As in a lot of European folklore, the dragon in Beowulf has a hoard of gold. Raglan's hero pattern, we've talked about this. We also talked about the idea that the slave, hoping to gain freedom, sneaks into the dragon's lair and steals the golden cup. And this brings the damnation and fire of the dragon. So that's important symbolism as we go. But we also know that the Battle of the Dragon is the final action scene in the story. When the dragon starts destroying his lands, Beowulf wonders if God is punishing him. But ultimately, he realizes the dragon is merely angry about the theft. I think that's an arguable point. I can certainly defend this as a Christian concept and why that's going to matter in the overall context. So, that's something you certainly want to pay attention to. He does begin to suspect that his fight against the dragon will claim his life. Now, there is an awareness of death here. And this is an idea that we're going to track through all these literature pieces, where there's an awareness, a growing sort of existence or importance about the role that death plays, both literally and then, of course, symbolically in the text. So I want you to also pay attention to the fact that when Beowulf goes to fight the dragon, he takes, again, those 12 men. And I'm sorry, 11 men. And I think that too, look at your numerology, the repetition of 3, more the idea of the apostles. So in the battle itself, as we move, we know that Beowulf brings his 11 best warriors, thus your 12, and heads out to fight the dragon and end the threat to his people once and for all. When they see the dragon, however, it instills fear, and they turn and desert Beowulf. In class on Friday, this was significantly discussion of Jesus' passion and how the apostles desert him in the final moments in the garden. Peter especially denies Jesus 3 times. So what that tells me is that when everybody flees out of fear, only the bravest warrior, the chosen one, if you will, the heir, looking at Raglan's pattern, is only one soldier is brave enough to stand up and fight beside the king, and that, of course, is Wiglaf, Wiglaf. One of Beowulf's relatives and his most loyal companion. What I think is significant here is that Wiglaf is willing to die for his king, and that's part of that theme of sacrifice. So I've already given you sort of 3 themes in this presentation if you've been taking notes, and I'm only at just under 6 minutes. How did Beowulf kill the dragon? Well, ultimately we know that he doesn't, right? Beowulf does not kill the dragon. Instead, he strikes at it with his sword, Nagling, and then so it's Naegling. The sword he used with Beowulf's mother is Runting, the one that melts in Grendel's blood at the end of that second part. Now, in the final portion of the poem, he again has another named sword that breaks. If you remember in class, I said specifically that that is a theme. So here at 6:38, you should be able to stop the video and write this down in your notes. So he takes Nagling to fight the dragon, but the sword breaks on impact. Who killed the dragon in Beowulf, of course, is Wiglaf. He's the one that after the dragon bites Beowulf fatally in the neck, Wiglaf jumps up, stabs the weakened creature, and as it says, it splits the body completely in half. Now that's a bit dramatic, but it works for the context and the overall ideas of the poem. It ends the dragon's tyranny, but it also claims Beowulf's life. That's a pattern that we see over and over again, especially in film. The hero sacrifices himself for the greater good or for the glory of the culture. So I think that's rather important. So we know that he's mortally wounded. So this transitions us out of that final battle to Beowulf's death. I think it's about a 50-line section of your poem. And so what we see is that Beowulf dies in Wiglaf's arms. But before he dies, he bequeaths or gives his kingdom to Wiglaf. So Wiglaf becomes the heir. And again, that seems to make sense to me. And it is Wiglaf who ultimately divides up the dragon's hoard and gives it to all of the people. So there is a sort of greatest good for the greatest number of people idea. Again, that is a definition that should ring a bell. This concept of, I don't know if I really remember the name, but I bet you do. So make sure you have that written down in your notes. Something else significant is in that section. Wiglaf is critical of the soldiers who fail to fight the dragon with Beowulf. He chastises or criticizes those not brave enough, or more importantly, those not loyal enough to stand by the king. And I find that to be important. So this is emphasizing that courage versus cowardice idea that has run its way through all 3 of these battles. The people of Geatland hold a funeral for Beowulf and build him a burial mound. Again, this should ring a bell based on your Raglan characteristics. There is a cultural idea, however, that without Beowulf, the culture will fail and the identity will go away and all of those concepts. And the monsters will come back and all of this. Since the best of kings has died and Wiglaf is unproven, there's a lot of really important sort of symbolism here in these ideas. So for the last portion of this particular section of the video, the scene in Beowulf where Beowulf and Wiglaf fight the dragon is central to the story's major themes. When Beowulf's men desert him, he feels that the heroic code that has governed his actions all his life has crumbled. Significant theme. Indeed, in the earlier parts of the poem, Beowulf's thanes, his supporters, his men, support him even during extremely dangerous battles, never questioning their loyalty to him and backing away from a fight. With the dragon, they all flee. This supports my idea that this is an end of days battle, that it's hugely symbolic. And it also supports that idea that men go to death alone. And I think that becomes very significant. The fact that he's deserted in the last minute calls into question the heroic code of the Anglo-Saxons. Remember in class, we talked about the transition from heroic verse to elegiac verse. This transition at the end of the poem, where the men desert Beowulf, is symbolic of that change from heroic to elegiac verse. The sense of change is also really evident in the dragon's symbolic meaning. It might be that the dragon represents death, Beowulf's death in particular, the death of Beowulf's society. Certainly, it's a metaphor. The fact that the dragon is red, as we discussed in class, has all kinds of important symbolism attached to it. In earlier parts of the poem, the text of the poem is interesting from a religious standpoint, which is part of what we've done, because it was written just at the point when Christianity was becoming more widespread in England. It is likely that the monks who transcribed Beowulf added references to the Christian God throughout the poem. Seems to me that you want to hold on to 4 or 5 of those specifically that you can track throughout the course of the poem. Since this is true, the fight between Beowulf and the dragon, and the despair that Beowulf's people feel at Beowulf's death, that idea of sacrifice, but the mourning in the elegiac verse, it's really an allegorical presentation of the death of pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon ideas. Beowulf's death is representative of the death of Anglo-Saxon ideas. And really, I think that gives you a nice chunk of information. So, to recap the lesson, what does the dragon symbolize? Both symbolically, metaphorically, and then literally in the poem. Why is it significant that Beowulf is afraid to fight the dragon? He still does, but nonetheless, he's still afraid. Why does he fight the dragon alone? Is that a metaphor? Hint, it is. If it's a metaphor, you got to be able to explain why it matters. And then ultimately, what happens as a result of those events in that final portion of the poem. Now, this, of course, is going to take us up to that official death of Beowulf, but I think it certainly encapsulates a lot of these ideas. So, I'm at 14 minutes and 9 seconds in this video. I'm going to attach some questions, and this is your first chunk to review.